Hi everybody. I wish I was there with you, but as you watch this, I'm in Atlanta with my Skills USA crew, competing in crime scene investigations and criminal justice. So I've got 4 students down here with me, and we're competing away, and having a good time, of course. But in the interim, here we are with Chapter 11, which I find it's kind of odd that they put this overview of the juvenile justice system in America at this point, but nevertheless, perhaps it's good. We can go back and recap. I know we covered in the beginning the 3 causations, and to some point we continue to address those as they're applicable. But, of course, our responsibility is what's going on in the future as far as the juvenile justice system and what processes are alive and well. So it's our job. And I put this picture here for a reason, because sometimes the parents won't do it. The system fails them. But once in a while, we have the ability to keep them, our kids, on the right path. So off we go. Hopefully. There we go. Oops, too far. And if you hear any noise in the background, I am in my office in Clarksville recording this, and it can get noisy. I apologize. So when I said it sometimes becomes our responsibility, and it's the little things to us, perhaps they feel little, but to these kids, they mean the world. So let's watch this.
We bring you the story behind this photo behind me that's gone viral, showing an emotional embrace between an LCM graduate and an Orange police officer at the teen's graduation. That officer was tasked with breaking tragic news to the teen about his parents' death just days before he walked across the stage.
Riley and Emily Porsche died when a pickup truck smashed into their motorcycle on West Park Avenue in Orange. The driver is facing 2 charges of intoxication manslaughter. Lieutenant Eric Ellison had to break the news to their youngest son, Cassie Porsche, less than a week before his graduation. Lieutenant Ellison says breaking the news to their youngest child was one of the hardest things he's faced in his 21-year career.
You just see life struggles that you see out here. It was really rough on the kid, rough on the rest of the Porsche family, and sometimes life's not fair, but you just got to go on. And I think Kaz is going to do that.
And he says he's proud of the Little Cypress Murraysville community for helping create a moment he says sums up why life matters.
If you didn't have a wet eye, you needed to check your pulse. The Montaigne Center, that was the loudest I've ever heard it. The class of 2015, 245 seniors, including Kaz, on their feet, and the parents and grandparents and friends all there right behind it.
He made sure Cassie was not alone when he made it across that stage.
Walked up on the stage, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both cried, and that's okay.
A powerful moment captured in these photos speaks for the tears shed by Lieutenant Eric Ellison. He broke the news to 18-year-old Cassie Porsche that his parents died in a tragic crash less than a week before graduation.
I said, you're going to walk, and your folks are going to have a front row seat in heaven watching you, and I'm going to be there.
As soon as Cassie accepted his diploma, Lieutenant Ellison was there to be the first person to congratulate him. The audience erupted in cheers.
It's those moments, folks. It's those moments. We have it, the power. We have the power to take someone's life. We have the discretion to write a ticket or not. And you get where I'm going with this. But we also have the power to do right by our community. Just little things make a big difference. Okay, switching gears. The juvenile justice system. Well, it's responsible for controlling and correcting the behavior of law-violating juveniles. Yes, it is. The system's, however, inability to accomplish its basic mission has resulted in massive criticism from all sides. Well, I hate to skip ahead. Sometimes I'm guilty of doing so. So I put these breaks in here for a reason. Otherwise, I get going and rambling. But let's watch this short video. Just give me a moment here.
Hey guys, how's it going? Today I'm going to show you my awesome new Wix website.
One second.
It's got everything I love all in one place.
There we go.
America's criminal justice system has never treated
hang
all
on.
citizens equal.
We're live.
To understand how we got here, we need to take a look at the evolution of the juvenile justice system. Back before the American Revolution, the colonies followed the common law of England when it came to criminal justice. This means that children were held accountable as adults. In 1646, Puritans in Massachusetts enacted a statute called the Stubborn Child Law. This made child disobedience a capital offense, allowing a death penalty option.
Crazy.
But then things started to change. In the 19th century, the idea emerged that children should be taken care of by the state. This notion ultimately empowered the state to serve as a guardian. In 1825, the New York House of Refuge opened for juveniles only. They were called delinquents to distinguish them from criminals. Reformers stressed that delinquents could be reformed, and if properly supported, they wouldn't turn into lifelong criminals. In 1899, Chicago reformers, also known as child savers, many of them disenfranchised women, decided to fight for the defenseless. One reformer, Lucy Flower, had been an orphan herself. The child savers pushed for the creation of the first ever juvenile court. This wasn't like a regular court. There was no jury. The judge didn't look down from a bench, but sat at a desk. Julian Mack, one of the first such judges, said a kid should be made to feel that he is the object of its care and solicitude. This court was the first of its kind anywhere in the world. Kids didn't get prison time, but instead were put in institutions or programs. Like parents, the court tried to steer kids toward becoming responsible adults. Within 25 years, most states started to think the same thing. Juvenile courts popped up everywhere, even in other countries. But for children of color, things were different. They were sometimes banned from houses of refuge or juvenile detention centers, and when convicted, they were more likely to be placed in adult prisons. Under Jim Crow laws, some cities like Memphis established separate juvenile courts for kids of color. A police officer, not a judge, presided over this court. After World War II, Americans seemed to relish the concepts of liberty and justice. The civil rights movement was well underway. Activists began to realize that while juvenile courts were designed to be less punitive, they didn't provide the constitutional rights enjoyed by adults. In 1967, for instance, 15-year-old Gerald Galt was accused of making an indecent phone call to a neighbor. Gerald was arrested without anyone informing his
Just
parents.
a phone call.
No record was made of his appearance before a judge or the neighbor who complained. Gerald was committed to a state school until he was 21. An adult with the same charge might have received a $50 fine.
Now look what
and 2 months
happens.
incarceration. Gerald's
Text.
parents brought his case to the Supreme Court. In 1967, that august body ruled that juveniles were entitled to due process. Then in the 70s, America started rethinking its criminal justice system. Crime had spiked, including juvenile crime. And in 1978, New York City passed the Juvenile Offender Act, a law that made it possible to try kids as young as 13 in adult court for murder charges and as young as 14 for other violent crimes like assault and robbery. That law caused states across the country to reinterpret who could enter the prison system as an adult. They were afraid that a new breed of super predators would sweep over the nation. Today, America incarcerates more juveniles than any country in the world. Every day, 53,000 children are locked up. That's more than a sold-out crowd at a Major League Baseball game. Nearly 60% of these children are Black or Latinx. Today, certain rights like the Sixth Amendment and the right to a speedy trial or a trial by jury remains only applicable to adults. Advocates have succeeded in getting almost all states to raise the age at which you are considered an adult to 18. But if you commit certain severe crimes, you can still be tried as an adult in the adult court and serve adult time.
You know, we live by our
What up,
history.
y'all? This is Felice Leon with the
Give me
Room.
one
We
second.
are dedicated to
There we go. You know, we live by our history, and sometimes our history is great, and there's some good and great concepts, and often there is not. And we have our own embarrassments, but we're not immune. You know, just like any other country, we have our successes and failures. And the same goes for the states, and the same goes for municipalities. And eventually it goes down to you looking in the mirror and doing the right thing by your community. We're not immune. Moving on. Maybe. Hang on one second. Looks like it's stuck. Just give me a second, folks. Yep. And it's trying. Just one moment. I'd like to say this would probably happen if we were live in the classroom. So we'll just bear with it. There we go. There it comes. Okay, hold tight. There we go. Moving on. Overcome and adapt, right? No problem. So, this is in your book. I wanted to look at the timeline. So at the top, we see here timeline of community-based corrections for juveniles in the United States. So let's go back to the 1820s rather. And it says superintendents of House of Refuge had the power to release juveniles from the institution. Well, they did. In the 1840s, the states set up inspection procedures to supervise those with whom juveniles were placed. So, you know, we could let them go or keep them in. Now, we realize, hey, we should probably keep an eye on these kids and where they're going. 1841, John Augustus, an important figure, began to supervise juvenile and adult offenders in Boston. Just give me 1 second to get this stuff out of here. Okay, moving down, 1825. The New York House of Refuge was opened, as we saw in the video. 1854, the cottage system was introduced. 1850 to 1860, juvenile facilities were called training schools or industrial schools. 1880 to 1899, the public became disillusioned, realizing that training schools were primarily custodial institutions and not rehabilitative. So there we go. We were using them in factories and as labor instead of working to rehabilitate these kids. 1869, Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, established a visiting probation agent system that supervised youthful offenders. So we realize here, 1869, 1841, it took a few years to get this really in motion. So we move along a few decades again to 1890. Juvenile probation was established statewide. Let's go up in 1950. The Highfields Project was established, and we'll talk about that. 1980. Retrenchment took place in community-based corrections. So we're getting a grip on what it is that, what we're doing for these kids. A multitude of programs came to fruition. So we'll cover those in a moment. Some succeeded, some not so much. So 2012 to present. Deinstitutionalization. I got that one right the first time. The number of youths held in confinement has dropped, and alternative community programs are employed. Yes and no. once we look at the multitude of programs that we have, we'll see that, again, some have worked and some have not. So just like I've told you before, data can be misconstrued. It's quite easy to shuffle numbers around. I think we're on our way to figuring out what we should be doing with our juveniles, but we're far from succeeding. I mean, I'm sure back in 1820 they thought that what they were doing was right. Have we made progress all the way to 2012 and present? Well, sure. Are we there yet? I don't think so. Moving on. So, the development of the cottage system and the construction of these juvenile institutions outside cities were two reforms of the mid-19th century. And a little bit about the cottage system. Introduced, as we saw, in 1854, it housed smaller groups of youths in separate buildings, usually no more than 20 to 40 per cottage. So we started to, instead of packing them in a large hall, if you will, in confinement, we started breaking them down to small groups. And that's kind of why I like working at North Georgia Tech, because the classrooms are small. The interaction is more positive instead of a large group. Now called training schools or industrial schools, these juvenile facilities were usually constructed outside cities. So we displaced them, and I feel in a good way, so that youth would be reformed through exposure to the simpler rural way of life. I've been a part of that. In the beginning of my career in the late 1980s and the beginning of 1990s, in law enforcement, my city only had 13,000 people with over 100 square miles. So we had a pretty big city, and a lot of it, which still is, was designated as agricultural. So we had Miami south of us, Tampa north of us, and we would have kids come in that had very little exposure to working with chickens and cows and pigs and understanding to actually touch a horse. So that was cool. We worked with some farmers and had a lot of these kids who were on probation to come down and spend some time. And the difference it made in their lives was, I saw it firsthand, was amazing. All right. The prevention of delinquency is certainly a desired goal. But just like the war on drugs, do we really win the war? No. Probably never win the war on drugs. But will we ever be able to prevent delinquency? I don't think we'll be able to prevent it. But how we manage it and how we deal with kids on a case-by-case basis perhaps is where we should focus. There are 3 different levels of delinquency prevention which have been identified. One is primary, and you guys and girls had this topic in your assignment. So primary, that's focused on modifying conditions in the physical and social environment that lead to delinquency. So, the conditions. This is environmental. We look at, physical to a point, but physical is tied in with environmental. We look at how they're growing up. What motivates them to become delinquent? What interventions can be placed to block some kids from migrating to that of a criminal mind? Secondly, secondary. Intervention in the lives of juveniles or groups identified as being in circumstances that dispose them toward delinquency. So we step in. And I gave an example in my hometown, or city rather, of what we did, and that's happening all around the country. There are programs to displace these kids and step in and try to let them see that there's a brighter world out there than walking the streets and getting involved in gangs, selling drugs, and ending up in prison. It's just not the way they want to be. Lastly, tertiary, I'm trying to pronounce it right, I apologize, directed at the prevention of recidivism and takes place in traditional rehabilitation programs. And the reason I put this Cops for Kids picture down at the bottom right is that's where we can step in as well. I mentioned the baseball bat, the the football, the basketball, and such that I kept in my trunk, and get out and play with these kids. I really felt, and there's no way to quantify this, that by reaching out to these kids, that one or two that we reached every time we went out, it made a positive difference. And perhaps they thought, when a group of their friends were going out and to commit crimes, maybe they stayed back, maybe they didn't. I don't know. I'm hoping they did. Okay, moving on. Okay, so promising prevention programs. And this is a long list. I hate to knock down or dismiss some of these, but I'll tell you my personal views of success or failure. And again, it's just my personal view. Big Brothers, Big Sisters of America, it works. It works fantastically. I sat in a lot of meetings as the assistant chief with this association, and our city did a great job with Big Brothers and Big Sisters. Bully prevention programs. We've seen how that has blossomed and the facets therein. And what I mean by that, and we discussed, I think last week, in cyberbullying, the effects that it has on our youth right now is staggering. So very essential and does work. Functional family therapy. I've seen that work when the actual family unit is present, but when you just have mom or just have dad or grandmother or an aunt or uncle, and you're trying to go through therapy that may involve the other siblings or both parents, and they're not there, it's kind of hard. But the efforts are good. Incredible Years, Parent, Teacher, and Child Training Series. I have no exposure to this, so I'm thinking that it's plausible. Life skills training. We actually have that here. If you think about it, our curriculum mandates that each student go through such as a critical skills training course that helps you prepare a resume, understand how to be a college student. I don't know at the lower levels, middle school or high school, if that's actually something that takes place, but we have it here. Multi-systemic therapy, MST. Don't know much about that one. Nurse-family partnership. Don't know. Project toward no drug abuse. I'm not aware of that one. Promoting alternate thinking strategies. I like that. Midwestern Prevention Project. Don't know what they do. Multi-dimensional treatment foster care. All right, so moving on. There are a lot of groups, a lot of programs. For example, if Steve is there, we talked in brief about the drug courts, and he submitted an assignment last week involving how he feels the drug courts in Union County help. And how can they not help? That's my answer. So you look at the diversion programs. At the top, alternative dispute resolution. Quite often, these mediation mandates come down from a judge to adult petitioners who are suing each other. So we have an alternative dispute resolution. It's mediation of sorts. But it also works with juveniles. To the right, we look at drug courts, youth court. If you file with the DA or the state attorney, depending upon what jurisdiction you work in, on a juvenile or make an arrest of a juvenile, you'll end up going to juvenile court. I always thought that was interesting because the judge specializes just in kids. The district attorney assigned, their whole caseload is nothing but juveniles, as well as the defense. So it's not someone coming in that's changing gears from adult to juvenile. In most jurisdictions, that's what their focus is working with the kids. So they're well aware of the diversion programs that are available. I've seen it work in Southwest Florida and Sarasota County, and it works great. Gun courts and community courts. I want to think that some jurisdictions really need the gun court aspect. I think that's obvious. With the climate today, well, I'll leave it unsaid. I don't want to get too political. Moving on. These are diversion programs. So, we have terminology for juveniles as well as adults as far as the adult and juvenile system terms. And in essence, it's semantics. They both mean the same, but I thought it'd be interesting to discuss them, at least in brief. Adjudicatory hearing. Adult, it's a trial. Aftercare, parole. Aftercare. I really thought that was interesting because now they're on parole, but we're going to care for them afterwards. Commitment, sentence to confinement. Detention, holding in jail. Dispositional hearing, sentencing hearing. Juvenile court officer, probation officer. Offender, defendant. Petition, indictment, petitioner. Prosecutor. Respondent, defense attorney. Taking into custody and arrest. It's, again, semantics. They all mean the same thing, but it's just terminology that's used in the juvenile system, I guess, to make it sound better. But they all mean the same thing. I just found it interesting. Okay. The system today. Who are we and where are we going? I guess that's the big question. We all want to know, who are we and where are we going? Well, I asked the same question in our juvenile justice system. So the system today involves the police and the juvenile court, juvenile probation, residential and day treatment programs, detention facilities, long-term juvenile institutions, aftercare, are all closely interrelated. So changes in one organization have definite consequences elsewhere within the system. Juvenile offenders often believe the system is too soft and that they will be on the streets in no time at all. Well, in some aspects, they're right, because they get that first, second, and third chance. Of course, depending upon what they did. First-degree murder, I don't think they're going to be released and taught a lesson. But kids that go out there and commit a robbery, burglary, sell drugs, they're going to get chance after chance to a point to where they are detained. But there's always viewpoints. There's always viewpoints as to whether they're soft or not, or whether they gathered valuable information. So here's a viewpoint from someone from the inside. I thought it was interesting, so I'm going to share it with you. Hopefully we don't shut down like we did before. If we do, oh well. It's about 20 minutes.
Ted Kennedy in the White House in '72.
We're family.
Okay, here we go.
Everything that I do is driven by a need to redeem myself, with an obligation to give back to our society. It all started when the metal door slammed shut onto the cell. It sent shivers down my spine. The chamber was cold and it smelled of stale air. You know, there's something about a door slamming shut that provides an eerie level of finality and reflection. You hear the echo of it in your mind for a long time to come. And as that door slammed, I started remembering all the advice that my parents, my teachers gave me, and I ignored it. And there I was, with plenty of time to reflect on all that information that I met with: disbelief, laughter, and scorn. June 24th, 1992, I made mistakes that I couldn't fix. After a long night of being violent, I ended it with beating a man, taking his wallet, and then trying to run him over with a car. And that's how, at age 17, that I was arrested, charged, and convicted as an adult. At an age where most kids are thinking about their high school prom, or they're thinking about who they're going to vote for next, I was facing 11 years. And while facing those 11 years, again, I had plenty of time to think about all my decisions. So after being sentenced to prison for 11 years, it took, well, you may think it took a lot of all the information that I did receive, that somehow that would get to me, somehow it would get through to me, but it didn't. And then I was finally sentenced to prison, where I met some of the most interesting people you'll ever meet. I met a man who ate mice, rats, and bugs. This man was also serving a life sentence for trying to skin another man after a drug deal went bad. I watched grown men melt into puddles of insanity as their minds could no longer take the conditions of the monotony of being in solitary confinement. I watched massive amounts of violence that included guards beating prisoners, prisoners being stabbed, and all this before I turned 18. And again, you would think that with that information and what I saw, what I experienced, that would get through to me, but actually it wasn't. It was actually one of the most unlikeliest people and one of the most unlikeliest of places that finally did get through to me. And it's a man who I'll always be grateful to, and his name was Alamin. In our conversations, he would tell me that his cell was actually his tomb, and that's how he would call it. He would say, "This is my tomb, this is where I'm living at." You see, he was serving 2 life sentences. And when there were disturbances or things going on, the guards always wanted to make sure they knew where he was, because they knew he was a man with no reservations about what he might do. So as we served our time together, he started teaching me a little bit about the strategy of chess. And eventually, I started to understand about how to look at chess in a whole nother light. And we were both in solitary confinement, but through the clutter, through the dirty floors, through the constant banging and yelling, I would get down on the floor and yell my chess moves through the vent, and he would yell his. And through those chess moves, he would always make sure that he would take time to execute them with another lesson. And some of those lessons that I started thinking about was in that cell, in that dirty, sometimes toilet-flooded cell. I started to practice virtues in life. And some of those virtues that I started practicing was simple, but yet profound. And it all tied into chess through those many years of of laying on the floor and playing this game. One, first lesson, respect everybody, no matter what their differences. And looking at the chessboard, respect each individual piece and understand that each square they're in is an important square. Two, to protect the weak. You may look at the pawn and it may appear as though at the beginning of the game it is the weakest piece, but it actually has the most potential than any other piece on the board to actually becoming the most powerful piece. And three, to be humble. Play the game as if every move counts. And that's how you make decisions in life. Don't take it as a given. And lastly, practice restraint. When playing the game, do not chase pieces. Play the game to win. We used to play 10, 20, 30, 40 games of chess, and tied in there, I learned the art of losing because I lost a lot of games. But through our many conversations, interactions, and just ability to communicate, I realized that my redemption was going to be obtained through education, perseverance, and helping others out. So I began to read. I read a lot. I read everything from Plato to Nietzsche to Machiavelli to Karl von Clausewitz. I read everything. But you may be surprised, but some of the most accessible books to prisoners are law books. They're heavy. They're really sturdy. Not only do they make good weights, but I also, through reading those law books and understanding them a little bit better, realized I could fight battles without ever having to pick up a sword. But I knew that I had to make sure, and I wanted to make sure that once I was released, I was to never return again. But in order to do that, when I did get out, I needed to make sure that I educated myself much further. Well, thank goodness for fast food restaurants, because the fast food industry does hire felons. And so when I got out, I started working at Taco Bell, and I also enrolled in the local community college. And in that local community college, I started there, and eventually 2, 3 colleges later, 5 years later, I eventually graduated with my bachelor's of paralegal studies. But so after I graduated, because of my volunteerism and because of the fact that I did obtain a much more formal education, I was granted permission by the state of Iowa to actually work in a facility with juveniles, actually at the same facility where I spent time as a juvenile. And currently, I supervise over 50 employees. That includes caseworkers, that includes program supervisors, and residential counselors and nighttime workers. I also provide crisis intervention to our local police department, hospitals, and I also work part-time at our local juvenile detention center. I was a guest there too. So, but I feel as though I'm making a difference, but that's not really enough for me. Not at all. What I need to do, and what I knew I needed to do in order to affect real change and in order to affect any type of policy change on a local, state, and federal level, I knew that I needed to further my education even more than that. So I eventually did receive a master's degree in criminal justice, and I'm very close to receiving a PhD in criminal justice. So when I'm looking at how do we work with kids in the system? We have to examine everything that gets them where they're at. We have to examine the trauma that a lot of these kids have experienced. We have to then introduce trauma-informed care. Now that's a philosophy. If you take anything from what I've said, I want you to take this. When you look at these kids, when you look at them, even the adults, these young adults, I want you to look at them, and instead of saying what's wrong with you, I want you to say what happened to you. That is the lens that will allow you to sort of look at these people in a different manner. So then as these pawns eventually go through the game, they can become one of the most powerful pieces as well. So
we're going to stop right there on that thought. It really illustrates what it is we've been saying. I just thought it was a great story. We see how deterrence works. Obviously, in this case, it does work, but of course, not every case turns out as well as this. I'd like to think that that it could. All right, enough. So we're going to move on. So let's discuss the expansion of restorative justice. How do we restore what it is that they being the offenders have done? How do we make it better? How do we instill on them, like this gentleman who we saw in his talk on this TED Talk, that they want to pay it forward, that they want to restore what it is they did and make amends? That's where it's almost unfortunate that there was no type of intervention before he got in so much trouble. I know he made something out of himself, which is remarkable, but what could we have done prior to? It's almost like society was starved of 11 years of a brilliant man who's contributing to his community and the kids. I guess there's two thoughts of that. Increased use of technology, sure, to our benefit. Greater use of evidence-based practice principles and approaches. And the question is, what can you do? What can you do? Well, you can be public servants for the kids. All right? You can be what it is that you can be, not to use a cliche, but you can be the best for the community with whom you serve. So I know I show a lot of videos today, but let's end it at this.
A sweet story many of you are searching and sharing on Facebook. A little boy's birthday almost turned into the worst day, but then he got the surprise of his life.
Oops.
His mother, Ashley Barati, joins me now via Skype from St. Cloud, Florida. Ashley, thanks so much for being here.
No problem.
So tell us what happened with little Glenn.
It was his first birthday where he invited friends from his class. And since there were 16 kids in the class, I just sent in, I actually sent in 17 invitations and put my phone number for RSVP. Nobody got back to me, but my mom's like, don't worry, you'll get a few of them that come anyway. And the day of the party, Glenn kept saying, how many minutes till my friends get here? How many minutes? And it got down to when they should have been there and nobody showed up.
So then obviously Glenn was very upset, and you, as his mom, you never want to see your kid upset because that is just an awful situation, especially on their birthday. So you decided to take it to Facebook. What did you post on Facebook?
We have a local rants and raves group, and I just decided to vent. And I just put how sorry I felt for my son and how we had invited the whole class and only, nobody showed up. And so that's when moms from the community decided that they were going to bring their kids to our house. And it just escalated from there.
Yeah, and it did escalate, and the response was so overwhelming, right? You've gotten support of the entire town basically now, and Glenn's birthday turned into something awful, it seemed in the beginning, to something so incredible and awesome and supportive for Glenn.
It really has. I've been really overwhelmed with the response that we've gotten for Glenn's story. I never in my wildest dreams would have guessed that venting on Facebook would have gotten this response.
What was it like to see all that support that you were getting for Glenn and then seeing his face when all those presents started showing up?
Shed a lot of tears. I'm about to start crying again. He was so excited to have the new friends come to our house, and then later in the day have the helicopter fly over from the sheriff's office. And then I got an email later in the day that the sheriff's office was going to come to our house the following week. And Glenn's face was worried at first when he saw the emergency vehicles at our house, but he quickly got really excited.
And you even got a flyover from the sheriff's office, which is pretty cool. I mean, what little boy doesn't want a flyover on his birthday? He got all, there we are, we'll look at the picture right now. Every wish answered.
Oh, there we go. So, prime example, what can we do? Well, there's an answer. You know, you think that child will ever forget that? No. The community won't either. And it's the little things. And to you, it's just easy. You know, anybody available, drive over there, and they did that, and they made his day. But these are the things that are happening, and I'm telling you, that are happening every day across this country. You don't see them in the news that often. And unfortunately, it's a rarity. If you visit an independent agency's website, of course, they're going to post it, but who's going to go to the 20, 30,000 law enforcement agencies and start clicking on websites to watch the great things that they're doing? Well, unfortunately, it's difficult. You can't do that. So you can, as well as me. Here I am sharing, and you can as well. So be proud, hold your head up high, do the right thing by the kids. You'll never know. Again, you may not be able to quantify what it is you're doing for the community for which you serve, but you know, once in a while you get a thanks and a pat on the back, and it feels good. So if you have any questions, let me know. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday. You are responsible for reviewing for your quiz that you have to take, yes, as well as getting your assignment submitted. Please do. I will be checking my computer, even though I'm not going to be there. I'm going to be checking and grading and so forth, and checking my email as I'm gone as often as I possibly can. So if you have a question, just I know I'm usually pretty prompt in responding, but just sometimes you might have to give me a little bit extra time this weekend, as I'm going to be out. All right. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you.